You can support this podcast at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, what were the historical factors that turned slave patrols and social order enforcers into an unaccountable police force in America? We'll review Power, the new documentary from Netflix. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hi, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is private investigator, certified pet detective, resident cat lady, and author of the Piper Green series of cozy mysteries, Laura Bricker. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Rebecca.
And finally, our resident doubting Thomas, author of the City Trilogy of novels, host of Strange Arrivals, and our Patreon Deep Dive Book Club podcast host, Toby Ball. Hi, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
So, Kevin.
Yeah.
This is obviously Thursday's program.
It's obvious to everyone.
What's coming up on Monday's show?
Monday, we'll be out with a new episode where we're talking about The Jinx, Season 2.
Fuck yeah.
Just in time for the finale.
All right. I cannot wait to talk about The Jinx Season 2. I want to start a book club about The Jinx Season 2. I don't know if you guys know this, but our oldest child, my son, Henry Lavoie, is not like what you'd call like a true crime fan. And he has been like texting me. He's the one, by the way, he watched the whole season 1 of The Jinx in one day because he was at our house for dinner one night and Jinx season 2 was coming out and he's like, what's The Jinx? And we're like, okay, we know you're not like a huge true crime fan, but if you watch anything, like you have to watch this. He called me, he watched the whole thing in one day and he called me and he was like, this was fucking awesome. And I was like, I know. It's sort of like the progenitor of like everything else. It's like, and he's like, it really holds up. He was like describing all these weird characters. And then he started watching The Jinx too. And he was like, Mom, I know you haven't started watching it yet. You gotta. He's like, I think it's better than season 1.
Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to start a book club about it.
First episode is amazing.
The first episode is astonishing. It's so fucking good. Anyway, I can't wait for you guys to watch it. Maybe you'll hate it.
I'm going to start watching it.
Yeah, it's my new appointment television right now. It's my Succession.
You mean Bridgerton? The new season of Bridgerton isn't your appointment television, Rebecca?
No.
Not enough sex.
Yes, there's way more sex in The Jinx season 2.
Is there? But is there? Is there bodice ripping?
Well, there's a cowboy. We'll just leave it there.
Some amazing characters. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. You could not fictionalize the characters in The Jinx season 2. Am I wrong, Kevin?
No.
If you wrote
There's more characters than we thought, yeah.
If you wrote a fiction story and included some of these people, Toby would be like, no, this is so fucking stupid.
Yeah, this can't be real.
No, it's really something. All right. That is not what we're talking about this time, however, is it?
No, it isn't.
All right, well, let's take the room down and do that because I think we should and it deserves our attention. So, Kevin, should we get started?
Yeah.
All right, let's do that. Leading off.
If we were starting a country tomorrow, and part of what we had to invent was a system of law and order, of criminal justice, of police, there's almost no chance we would invent the system we currently have.
How did American law enforcement get to its present state of near unaccountability? An examination of its history shows policing has its origins in running slave patrols, displacing indigenous tribes, and coercing organized labor. Once used as a tool by the powerful to maintain social order and protect their personal property, modern police have become a power unto themselves.
This used to be referred to as ATM, ask, tell, make. First I ask someone to do it, then I tell them to do it, and if they don't do it at that point, I physically make them do it.
With the help of tough-on-crime politicians, law enforcement has only grown in strength and resources. And despite an onslaught of high-profile police brutality, murders, and misconduct cases, legal protections prevent most cops from being answerable for their actions.
We're talking about ensuring that what police do is lawful, and when they behave in a way that's not lawful, they're held accountable to that. But the biggest problem with policing today is that most of the harm that policing causes is perfectly legal.
The Netflix documentary Power is a deep dive into the history of policing in America and where it's going in the future. Historians, academics, and critics discuss the problems of a system that demands unqualified compliance from its citizens. The film also asks whether the police or people that they serve and protect ultimately hold the real power in America. Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about plot points from Power, so if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down reviews. Additional note, I am the host of Netflix's You Can't Make This Up podcast, and I did interview Power director Yancey Ford, but that has not influenced my review. So Kevin.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you a question. You don't have a note about this, but I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I found this documentary, and I think that there is a portion of the population that will just automatically not want to watch this, right? They either like it's not for them, or they feel like they won't be able to, they just disagree with the premise, or that, they've just sort of like turned off by the idea of things being, quote, anti-cop or whatever.
Right.
I found this documentary to be exceptionally, I don't want to use the word fair, but in many ways, I think it's very measured in its approach to this topic. It's straight history, and it has a lot of real academic sort of approaches, and a lot of I think asks questions that I think that people from the entire range of the spectrum of views on police should be asking. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it did the law enforcement profession any favors. If anything, I think it was a sober look at the issues, not, for lack of better terms, sensationalized or very heavy-handed. I think it was very smart in that way. I think it was, this is a real thinker. It shares a lot of its DNA with 13th, if you remember that documentary from a couple of years ago. So, forgive the pun, but I think this is really powerful.
Yeah. So, Toby, this is very put together in a really interesting way. It sort of has a sort of essay component to it, and a sort of very artful cinematic style in the way that it's put together. And we'll talk about sort of some of the scenes and then what we see and don't see later in our conversation. But it's not untrod ground for us, certainly. I'm curious how you approach something like this when you really do understand the history, as I know you do, and you watch something like this. What are you looking for to say this one has my attention, this one feels different, this one feels new?
Yeah, I think what this does, and again, like you said, I feel we've kind of confronted a lot of these things on our show. I think the deep dive, some of the books we've done there have also, the new Jim Crow, I think is obviously influential on this. But what I think this does really well is it kind of synthesizes a lot of those things. It takes a lot of those little sort of themes that we've come by in different true crime shows or podcasts or whatever, and kind of pulls them together, gives them historical context, and then kind of builds this picture of the police as an institution and how it grew from essentially trying to ensure that people kept their slaves to now we've sort of acquiesced to having police that have a hell of a lot of power and are sort of ubiquitous, and sort of how that happened and what does that actually mean? That we have police that you essentially have to comply with. It doesn't really matter how wrong a police officer is or anything like that. You have to comply, and then hopefully it gets worked out later if it's wrong. But it's sort of this unquestioned authority that's put in the hands of enough people to fill the state of Delaware, apparently.
To demand unqualified compliance, which is what the police demand, goes against what I think the majority of Americans believe our society to be, which is a democratic society where you don't have to be subjected to essentially authoritarian commands.
So yeah, again, there's something that I heard. I was like, oh shit, I'd never heard that before. But I think the way that it's put together and then kind of the way they frame sort of the conclusions that they draw, I thought was interesting.
So, Laura, there is this one incredible quote in this documentary, and I was so stunned by it that Kevin and I watching this together, and I was like, can you pause and go back so we can hear that again? And that's this guy, Julian Go from the University of Chicago, and he says that the power of the police is to demand unqualified compliance, as Toby just said. That is such an interesting expression, and it kind of gets to what I was saying at the beginning about I think there really is something here that everybody should watch, because I think about folks on the other end of the political spectrum, who are, we may see it in a certain way when they say things like the slogan being, by the way, I will not comply, around things like government overreach, vaccines, all that stuff. That's literally a slogan, the I will not comply. And here we have one body of our actual government, which I think this documentary talks about really well, that the police are actually a governmental institution. And like, we have no problem questioning the authority of every other governmental institution we have and pushing back and resisting, on both sides of the political spectrum, on all sides, young people, old people, there's a lot of pushback against government stuff. And for some reason, this one institution doesn't get that pushback. I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that, because that's kind of what I was trying to get to at the beginning of this conversation.
Right. And I think where that particular issue sort of came front and center for me is when they were talking about, now $129 billion is funded by the federal government for policing every year. Because they use historical clips very well in this, and they were showing the clips. And it wasn't just like Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. It was all presidents talking about law and order. Like we have Clinton talking about funding community policing, and you see like these riots happening in the background.
So far, $3.5 billion of the Recovery Act has gone to support local law enforcement.
I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order.
It's interesting to me that it's something that seems to be like universally accepted on both sides of the political spectrum in terms of just the clips that we were seeing. And when you actually kind of take a step back and think about it philosophically, as we are doing here, as you're seeing in this documentary, there's a lot that could be changed.
Yeah.
And you're not hearing about that. When you hear about that, it's considered like fringe and like super leftist. There's like no middle ground between shifting how we're doing it and then like the defund the police narrative, right?
Yep.
So you're not seeing any other options. And it's interesting because you watch this, and for me, I'm like, gosh, like the police in my town, like we're community policing here, and it's a very different animal.
Right. Just one thing that I think is really important to talk about with the politics around this is that, Kevin, as Laura was saying, like this has become a political talking point, right? Like this is not new, that politicians use crime to get elected, and then that talk of crime changes perception, public perception about crime. So I looked it up, and I knew this was true, but I actually looked at the statistics. So crime is not up. Crime has been going down precipitously since the early 1990s. However, every single year, the American people believe to a greater extent that crime is increasing. But violent crime is down 49%, property crime is down 59%. Every single year, the FBI data, the FSB data, all the data shows that crime has been dropping precipitously for years and years and years. One interesting fact is that Americans will largely say it's not happening in my neighborhood, but I'm seeing it in America. Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting data point. And Kevin, like, I think that one of
why do they say that?
They say
they're getting their news.
They say that because but it's not just news.
It's a perception, yeah.
It's also influence of people running for office and promises they're making. And like, it's, there's just a general culture of fear mongering in the United States that has fueled a lot of this, right? And so, Kevin, there is like this interesting observation too, that there's this crossover in we're talking about the federal government stuff between the police and the military.
Right. And we've seen this in other things that we've talked about. Whereas the military just sort of had excess equipment, or you get the Homeland Security money, and so they give stuff to cops, and what do the cops want to spend it on? They get Bearcats and all sorts of militarized equipment, and it's a militarization of the police. One of the interesting points that I picked up from this is how the military itself acts more like policemen when they are deployed. That is more about like what their assignment ends up being. Because like when they're deployed, what are they doing? They're not acting as infantrymen. They're not like digging trenches to take up positions, and they're directing traffic. They're running prisons. They're riding patrols through urban areas. They're maintaining social order. And it's funny how in some ways like these roles have reversed, where I'm not saying that like people in other nations are getting better treatment from the U.S. military than the police in America are, but it might seem like that to some people.
Yeah. And, notably, like the visuals of military and police have become conflated.
Yeah.
Not just with the equipment, but with the covered faces. Like the policemen have become anonymous.
Right. But I mean, this crossover, because like in a way, their missions are the same, where it's to maintain social order.
Right.
So the training, the philosophies, those techniques, like there is an overlap. So you could see them in both places.
Right. So, Toby, we do hear this expression in the documentary, violence work, which is essentially you just threaten people with violence constantly, and that is actually more effective than committing the violence itself. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's similar to the Curtis Flowers thing when we talked about how like sort of these arbitrary prosecutions help keep people in line just because you just don't know. And that it creates fear of authority and all this stuff. And I think it's sort of similar to this, which is like if you go through your life worried about the potential for police violence against you or a false charge or whatever, like that affects your behavior. That makes you more submissive. I think they talked about this in the context of stop and frisk, which was largely targeting Black and brown people, and that their actual gun confiscation rate in stop and frisk was 0.1%. So 1 in 1,000 stops ended up actually getting an illegal gun off somebody. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this kind of ties into a little bit of the militarization of the police, is that it's not even like you're trying to maintain public order or stop specific crimes. It's like you're trying to create a situation in which you have control. And that's not something that we think of. I think when we think of our country, is that like parts of it are just controlled by police, but that certainly seems to be the objective. Not everywhere. I don't feel like in Durham, my streets are controlled by cops. But, you know, even in a little town that I was living in New Hampshire, I got pulled over for speeding. And the guy's like, why? He's like, you cannot be speeding through my streets. I'm like, how the fuck are they your streets, dude? Yeah. I mean, I thought they were my streets too, since I pay taxes, including your salary. But
you're his boss.
But it is. But if that's happening to me in like some tiny dipshit town in New Hampshire, like it's just like in cities or some of the examples they show here, it's like a real occupational force in these communities trying to control, like assert dominance.
I think we will get to the idea of the we-ness later.
Absolutely.
But this is like lays out a problem, like why this doesn't break through in the mainstream. Because as white Americans, we feel like probably the worst thing that can happen in a traffic stop is that we'll get a ticket. Our lived experience is very different than Black Americans or brown Americans who get pulled over. Toby got read the Riot Act. Did you get a warning or did you get a ticket in that?
I probably got a warning. Yeah, I don't get too many tickets. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So that's the experience for most white Americans, which means we're not really motivated to like say, oh, there's something wrong with the police. Our interactions with the police are traffic stops where we get let off with a warning, or we see hero cops on television who break the rules, but it's because the system doesn't work and we think all cops are great. And we are slow to learn this truth that other people have been saying, that there is a problem with law enforcement and that one of the major issues is violent racial inequality that they continue to fuel.
I'm sorry, I thought you were going to go into the business section. So why don't you just do it? Since I just said that, let's do it. Let's do it. Like Kevin, speaking of fuel, what's fueling us into our business section?
Well, as far as like really awkward transitions,
I mean, that's going to be a winner.
There's up there. Hey, we want to let you know that if you join us at patreon.com/partners in crime media at the Let's Do What We Do level, you can get episodes of Crime Writers on early and ad-free, along with other great things, different levels. You can hear Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast. The next episode of Deep Dive will be looking at the book The Good Girls, An Ordinary Killing by Sonia Falario. Toby probably hasn't cracked that book just yet.
That would be a safe assumption.
Yeah, that's usually Toby's. He does the binge reading on a deadline. We have Married with Podcasts, and we're going to be doing a live stream version of an upcoming episode where Rebecca and I will give advice. We'll do it in front of a live Patreon audience. Maybe invite you to come on and ask a question or two. We'll give you our
Laura's got questions.
Our unqualified advice. Yeah, Laura's always getting into trouble, and she puts that in her Leave It to Bricker podcast. Laura, what's going to be on the next Leave It to Bricker?
Bricker Goes Burlesque.
Oh, wow. Woo. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
You go burlesque or you go to
I go
burlesque?
to burlesque, but
Okay.
I thought it sounded catchier when I said Bricker Goes Burlesque.
Because they do have those pasties with the tassels on it. And if you can get them to swing in the same direction, that's how you know you're talented.
I saw some of those.
You saw some of those.
And I'll tell you all
How it
about
works.
it in the next Leave It to Bricker.
Oh, that's absolutely worth the extra $1 a month. We also have an Amazon storefront where you can see some of our favorite things. Rebecca, what are this week's Amazon recommendations?
Oh, one of my favorite things that I buy on Amazon through our store, because I started our link, right? And then I can go to our store. I mean, I can't, but I would if I...
Just because you deleted the app.
No, it's because, but I love the Moroccan oil leave-in conditioner spray. I love it so much. It makes my hair so shiny.
And Toby Ball, what are your listener-inspired Toby Ball's deep cut recommendations?
I'm going to lead off with the G for Free loose pants for women, high-waisted yoga dress pants with pockets, stretch wide leg sweatpants, business casual trouser pants.
That's business casual?
Wow. 29 inches.
Okay.
I thought yoga pants, like the idea that they're loose, I thought that was like yoga pants were supposed to be
And they have
tight.
pockets?
Anyway, pockets, a whole bunch of stuff going on here. But it's sweatpants and business and casual.
Nice.
So you got all the bases covered. Yep.
Lots of metadata there.
And then I guess if you're wearing those and you get hungry, you can get the Rudder Flow 100% black. That's not food. That's something else. I flipped down one too far. All right. So if you don't want anybody to see you in your yoga pants, you can do the Rudder Flow 100% blackout curtain.
Nice.
Heat and full light blocking drapes with grommets for bedroom thermal insulated window treatment drapes F.
Nice.
And cucumbers if you shop us first.
No, just cucumber.
Just one cucumber.
Shop us first at amazon.com/shop/crimewritersOn. We earn commissions on qualified purchases.
All right, Kevin, before we end the business section, I have to ask, as we gracefully transition out of it, do we have any Patreon patron saints of the week this week?
Our Patreon patron saints are Alicia Hopkins and Sarah Mirza. Bless you.
Alicia, Sarah, thank you so much for being on our Patreon. And by the way, if you want to hear your name on the radio / this podcast, join us on Patreon. Go be a member. Kevin will probably read your name someday because he picks them at random. Anyway, patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. Thank you so much for muscling through the business section and for being our saints of the week. Kevin, can I fade that music out now?
You can do that.
So, Laura, the city of Minneapolis is where George Floyd was murdered. And here in this documentary, we have a cop in the city of Minneapolis talking about the reforms he would like to see in the criminal legal system and in policing. Charlie Adams. What did you think of Charlie and his inclusion here?
I like this because there were a lot of academic talking heads in this documentary. And, I like to be able to latch on to like somebody like a human narrative, like somebody that I feel like I can invest in and that I'm interested in what they're saying. And Charlie was really, I thought it was brave that he went on and shared his story. And one thing I thought was super interesting is he was talking about the use of cameras and how they can be helpful. And I was like, this is just like CCTV and every British show I watch, and how that was going to be a better form of like honing in on actual crimes that were happening as opposed to just kind of randomly getting involved in things. He, talks about like shortcomings that he's seeing in the police. He's talking about things he's witnessed over the years, but he's very like even as he's talking about this. I feel like he was very forthcoming. Like the first scene, you're driving down the road with him and he's like, and our like football quarterback got a shot.
Last year, a 12-year-old was shot right here. You see where he was shot fighting with another kid from up the street. When I pulled up here, I've never had somebody tell me who did it so quickly, because there's still people I grew up with that live down there,
What happened to that 12-year-old?
He died.
He talks about what it's like for him being a black officer. And, he recounted that one story where it looked like somebody turned on him as a suspect, even though he was out there as a police officer.
Yeah.
So he, I think, was very open about both sides of that in a way that I'm like, I kind of am like, geez, what's going to happen to him when this documentary comes out? But also like good for him for acknowledging that things need to change. And also I liked how they talked about how he's planning to like stick it out to retirement, and he's going to see his career through.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's in it to win it.
Yeah.
He's in it to win it. Yep.
Chubby, I'm curious. I want both your and Kevin's takes on this. There's a really interesting artistic choice in this documentary to show these scenes of violence that ends in death of a couple of people, including George Floyd, where they actually black out the person who was killed and they keep the actor, the cop, and they keep the bystanders, and they sort of have everything else sort of be out of the viewer's view. And I think this is sort of the opposite of what we've been, in the last couple of years. It's like, you should look, you shouldn't look away, you should look. And in this documentary, you're sort of challenged to look at the actor and the bystander. What do you think about that choice in the documentary?
I thought it was interesting in a couple of different ways. One of which is, again, it's like, how do you show these things, right, without being exploitive, with maintaining the dignity of the victim, things like that. So that's one part of it. I think the other part of it was showing just how acquiescent the bystanders have to be. Like, even if they're protesting, which I guess maybe it's the George Floyd one, like, you can hear people just like, has he moved? He's not breathing. Like, basically pulse. Getting on these cops, like, make sure he's still alive. And the cops are basically telling them to fuck off. But again, it kind of shows this dominance. It's like, people aren't like rushing the cops and like pulling them off this guy who they've got. It's like, you're just kind of yelling at them to do something, but you're not going to physically take the steps. So I think it allows you to focus on that dynamic, which again, I think is sort of the point that they're making through this whole thing, is that it's not necessarily about this arrest or that arrest or whatever. It's sort of the pervasive effect that the police have on the societies that they're policing, especially Black and brown communities, which rightly so. So yeah, I thought that was effective. And in a couple cases, I thought it was like pretty moving. And I think it showed the power disparity at play pretty starkly. Yeah,
I agree. The interesting visual things happening. There's a lot of imagery at the very beginning and the end of like these atomic bomb tests, like just, sort of the power of the atomic bomb. And I guess we're to draw, a parallel to the power of law enforcement. That whole thing with the George Floyd video where they chroma keyed out everything except the one cop who his job was to stand there sort of like with his back to what was going on and prevent these, we see at least two bystanders here. One of them's videotaping. Of course, we have whoever's taking, those folks. It was done, I think, in part to maintain George Floyd's dignity in that moment, but also to sort of like say, hey, also check out what's happening here on this side of the frame, because this is important too. And I thought that was a great way of sort of circling in on that and getting you to think about that. And there are other times, just production-wise, other note here, the times where the director who's narrating just sort of talks directly to the audience. It opens up with, sort of this black screen where he just basically starts off by asking people to, in the words of George Michael, listen without prejudice.
The movie usually starts now, but I want you to know this film offers an analysis of police history that I'd like you to consider. This film requires curiosity, or at least suspicion. I leave that choice up to you.
While a lot of it is talking head interviews with some very smart people, and there are elements here of active documentary work where you're following Charlie around and you're doing some other things like that sort of take you outside of the studio, I thought that there was some interesting takes on how to make this visually interesting.
So, Laura, legal consequences in the George Floyd case are extremely unusual because police misconduct, police violence is actually legal, in large part because police have what's called qualified immunity, meaning that they are not prosecutable or be able to be held account for things that they do during the course of their work if they have a reasonable assumption of danger, or it can be interpreted that way. What do you think about qualified immunity and how it has this ripple effect on how policing is conducted in the United States?
It kind of makes my blood boil when I hear about qualified immunity. I think just because I feel like it shields police in a way that basically, and I think this is what they said in the documentary, that most of the harm modern policing causes is perfectly legal. Basically, it allows them to avoid any sort of consequences unless they violate a, quote, clearly established law. And it's used to get out of any sort of civil liability, accountability for engaging in violent or abusive acts. And so this means that, like, if you're in a jurisdiction and they're like, oh, there's no other case exactly like this, then nothing's going to happen to this particular police officer. And I guess the challenge here is that I don't want to sound like I'm bashing all police, but I think there's some population within the police world where you can have particular police that get rough over and over again. and nothing happens because they're like, well, we thought something was going to happen to us, so we were justified. Different states tackle it differently, but like overarching all of that is this idea of qualified immunity that basically goes back to this use of force case that they talk about, Grant versus Connor, and when force can be used and how that can be justified. And unfortunately, I feel like that just sort of perpetuates this cycle that we're seeing, where we're feeling like it's like people versus police. And like, you're seeing these situations repeat over and over again because there's nothing to break that cycle as long as that standard is there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's an incredible moment in the documentary where Yancey Ford is interviewing Christy Lopez from Georgetown Law. And she says, quote, "We have allowed police misconduct to be legal." And he says, "I have a question about the we-ness of it." But, I felt like he was like, what do you mean we?
We're the ones who make it legal. I'm not trying to absolve the police from responsibility. But the fact is that most of the harm that they cause is perfectly legal.
So I'm interested in the we-ness of it all. You've both made similar points about the laws that we let the police enforce and the things that we let the police do. And I sit here and I'm like, I don't let the police do.
Toby, what did you think about when you heard him sort of ask that question, and that long moment of silence was just sitting there? The questioning the we-ness, the we have allowed all of this stuff to be legal.
Yeah, it was an interesting moment. I don't know if there's like a simple answer to that question. I think the point she's making is that through elections, we have sort of at least given the impression that we want our elected representatives to be quote unquote hard on crime. And that seems to like morph into more cops, more power for cops, more sort of weaponized stuff for cops. And then the question is my community is not psyched with cops, and we wouldn't have supported that, which is fair. It's the idea that there's some kind of one size fits all sort of policing for the country. The idea that something that would work in Durham, New Hampshire, would work in Chicago, would work in Houston, would work in LA, would work in Central Iowa, would work, I think there's different needs for different things. So there's different desires within the community for what is important. But I think what this documentary shows is that it's not like that locally responsive, is that there is a culture of dominance. Like you have to own the streets. You have to be able to control. And they have some like pretty good scenes of like, people on that block, you got to move them out. They think it's their block because they live here, but it's not. It's our block. Like if that's the attitude that is sort of pervasive. And I think, again, Laura mentioned individual police and stuff, and there is that, and you don't want to tar everybody with a big brush. But I think institutionally, I think it is safe to say that you're following a certain philosophy, and it feels like, and maybe it's just that there's been more exposure to it, and it may be sort of a similar thing as to why people think there's more crime when there's not. But this idea of militarization, consider yourself sort of an occupying force in the community in which you're supposedly serving, that feels as though that's in kind of an accelerating mode. So it feels like things are going in the wrong direction. And I can see where it'd be like, I did not condone this or want this or approve of this. It's just kind of happened. And I think that's what this documentary is pretty effective at, kind of showing how that came about.
What I heard in that silence actually sort of cut me to the bone, because he's like, I have a question about the we-ness of it all. And I agree with you that it's about like who's been elected, who's in power, and the laws that those people make. But then I think I, a white woman, am the most enfranchised, empowered person in our democracy. Who are the most disenfranchised people in our democracy, who have been gerrymandered, who's had their votes suppressed, who has been like every attempt made to keep people from voting freely and fairly and easily. It's not white women from New Hampshire, right? So when you want to question the we-ness of it all and what's legal and what's not legal, you can't just say, hey, we all voted for this, because it's not easy for everybody to have. We don't all have the same amount of power in our democracy. We just don't. And so that's kind of what cut me to the bone in that silence. All right, let's do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out Power on Netflix, Laura Brick, or what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down for this doc?
So I'm going mild thumbs up because for me, so I think that this is a really good primer for learning about policing, how it evolved in history, how it became sort of a military style operation, brings context to policing, how it relates to the Black community. They use good clips. They have history. It's got a really great overview. I think for me, what I struggled with is it was very academic. And so it came across to me as a little bit more dry and felt to me like, okay, this is something they're going to show like kids in college in a class to give you like a good overview if you want to learn about this. For me, I felt like I was a little bit back in school. And I think we need to be on this issue, but at the same time, it was a little slow at times in the way that it was structured for me. And in terms of having a lot of talking heads and not as many actual people in there that were affected. So mild thumbs up.
Toby Ball, thumbs up or thumbs down for Power on Netflix?
I'm actually a pretty big thumbs up. I like this a lot. I agree with Laura in that, they do talk to academics. There's sort of theory aspects or whatever. I think what makes it, to me, like not feel academic is that there's clearly a lot of anger in this show that I feel comes through. And so I think just that sort of, I don't know if it's emotional directness or whatever, that's kind of running through it makes some of this stuff where you might just like reading it in a transcript or whatever be like, oh, okay, well, I guess that's kind of interesting. Like when I was listening to people talking about it, it was like, these are major things, right? This is not like, these aren't small issues. They're not sort of specific to a certain area or a certain person or whatever. These are like large systemic issues that affect our whole country to different extents, but are that pervasive. So, I think if you've been listening and watching and reading the stuff that we do on Crime Writers On, there's probably not a ton of stuff that's just going to come out of the blue. But I think the way it's sort of put together, synthesized, and just sort of the overall sort of impression that you're left with when you're done, I think is pretty powerful. I don't know. I mean, I think it's an excellent, like Laura used the word primer. I think that's an excellent term for it. Like if you want an introduction to like this mode of thought about the police, I think this is excellent. I agree with just about everything he had to say. So I give it a big thumbs up.
Kevin Flynn.
Yeah, I'm also a big thumbs up. I thought this was a superior meditation on the issues surrounding law enforcement, particularly in the way that it relates to racial injustice. The documentary is kind of summed up by this one quote from Frederick Douglass about how power concedes nothing without a demand. So I think we're left with the question about what kind of demand can lead to meaningful concessions. And it's hard because it's left to us to decide. But we have created a system which makes this very difficult. I did think it was good to get this historical context. I mean, I think a lot of us, for me, I just used to assume that like, they built a city and that's how they got libraries, fire departments, and the police department. And it just didn't realize sort of the dubious origins of this public service. So it was very thoughtful. It was academic, but that's kind of what I enjoyed about it. There are a lot of entries in this subgenre of true crime that deals with the failures of the criminal justice system, and I think this is one of the better ones. So thumbs up.
I agree. I'm giving this a big thumbs up too. And one of the things that really bothers me is that I know that like in my like endorsing this and loving it, people are going to say like Rebecca Lavoie is like anti-cop, right? I don't think that even this documentary is quote anti-cop because it does not address like individual cops as people. It's talking about the power that this system of policing has now gained in our country and how that is something that we should all be united in agreeing is wild. It is like there is no other part of our government that is this dominant in our society. There's no other part of our government that says, if you don't do this, I can kill you and get away with it. There's no other branch of our government that can do that. And the police force can, and it's legal. And I just feel like so frustrated by the fact that this has become like a right wing or left wing or Republican or Democrat or like issue or like anti-cop, pro-cop. It's not that. It's about this system completely spiraling out of control, not being built right, not being conceived in the right way, and how we are letting it happen. By we, I don't mean all of us. I mean, obviously, I mean those of us with more power and like more ability to influence the system, how it's just happened around us. And like we spend all this time not questioning it and afraid to speak out against it because we're afraid of being called anti-cop. That is not what it's fucking about. I think this documentary does a very, very good job of getting at that. And that's why I really, really appreciated it and liked it. And I loved the question about like the weeness. And I loved the questions about the violence work. And I really loved the artfulness of how this was put together and the sort of meditative essay aspect to it. So yeah, I'm giving this a big thumbs up. Big thumbs up for me for Power on Netflix. That's going to do it for us. But Laura Bricker, I have to ask you a little turn here before we go. Do we have a cat of the week this week?
We have a first of its kind this week, Rebecca.
We do.
We have a queen bee of the week.
Shut the fuck up.
Oh, yes, we do.
An actual literal queen bee? Not like a witchy girl in second grade who's like bossing all the other girls around.
No, Jenny Porter Tilley, one of our longtime listeners, also fellow journalist, sent this. It's a bee. Her swarm terrified race fans at last year's Indy 500. They've been through a few life cycles, so only the queen is still around. The beekeeper who rescued them is letting us name her. So far in the lead for naming the queen bee is Janet Guthrie, which is based on Janet Guthrie, the first woman to qualify for the race.
A bee.
A bee. So if you want to go vote on the name, you can go on the Indy Star newspaper, look up the article, and find out how to vote.
How about Toby Ball?
Toby.
You know it's going to be some stupid shit like B McBeeface. It's always like that, right?
B McBeeface, yeah.
Like the Bodie McBoatface. All right, Laura Bricker, if folks want to reach out to you and get more information on how they can vote, how to name this bee, how can they find you online?
They can find me at Laura Bricker on Twitter and Instagram.
And Toby Ball, if folks want to reach out to you and see maybe a photo of your Orange Crush t-shirt, how can they find you online?
At Toby Ball NH.
What about you, Kevin? How can you be found?
I'm a Kevin P. Flynn.
If you want to follow me everywhere, Twitter, Instagram, the other places, you can find me at Reb Lavoie. You can follow the show everywhere, Instagram, the other places, at Crime Writers On. You can follow us on YouTube, find us on Reddit. But mostly, I encourage you to join our incredible community in our official Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. That's where all the good shit goes down. Just find us on Facebook. There's a link to join the group. We'll let you in if you know any one of our 4 names. Get episodes early and ad-free at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. You'll also get the Crime Writers On After Show, Married with Podcast, Laura Bricker's Leave It to Bricker podcast, and Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcasts. Our theme song was composed and performed by Ty Gibbons. Our line editor is the wonderful Livy Burdett. The executive producer of this show is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in the Treehouse Yoga Studio above the Mockingbird Cafe in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, The Closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where we also become unaccountable enforcers of social order. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later. All right, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Yep.
Fucking hot in here. All right.
Yeah, you look a little toast hot in here too.
Well, it's because I can't open the window because these motherfuckers are blowing shit.
These motherfuckers.
Did you have one of those little O fans?
I do. That's an idea. Here it is.
You look like Beyonce with the hair going shh.
I feel like Beyonce.
The little tuft just going like boop, boop, boop,
boop.
Okay.
What's your shirt say, Toby?
It's Orange Crush.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Well, if you need to take it off.
Take it off,
Don't.
Toby.
Yeah,
Don't.
Screenshot it at the $17 level.
Partners in Crime Media.